Huh?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, just stick it there close.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, good evening, everybody. I'm glad you're back. Those of you that are new, thank you for coming. I hope that I can both be entertaining and informative. I've got a lot of information I've got in my brain, and how it's going to come out, I don't know. Y'all will be the judge. But I'm going to, for those of you that weren't here last week, I'm going to do a quick review because we talked about metabolic disease last week, and we got another name for metabolic disease. It's called insulin resistance, and that's what everyone has to understand, insulin resistance. As a reminder, every cell in the body has to have two nutrients for normal function. That's oxygen and glucose. There are three sources of glucose. But all of them have to be eaten. I made the statement last, they didn't all have to be taken in, and I was thinking about carbohydrates. I don't know what I was, anyway, I was wrong. John said, no, they all have to be eaten. Well, all protein, all fat, all carbohydrate has to go in right here. So all sources of glucose have to be ingested. Now, they don't have to be ingested every day, but because muscle can be mobilized and become a source of glucose. Fat can become a source of glucose. It has to go through a metabolic pathway, but neither one of those have to be ingested on a daily basis in order to provide the body with glucose. But the way that 70% of the world gets its nutrition, and I'm not just talking about the United States, 70% of the world gets their nutrition from carbohydrates. And most of the carbohydrates are sold with a barcode on them, either in a sack or a box. And those are the bad ones, because anytime it says sugar on the box, it's one molecule of glucose and one molecule of fructose. When it's added sugars, it's even a higher percentage of fructose. And one of the rabbit holes I plan to go down tonight is the fructose rabbit hole. It's a bad hombre. It's poison. But there are two sources of fuel, the two normal sources of fuel for the body. As you see up here I got some PowerPoints this week, and so I'm not used to doing PowerPoints. I'm used to extemporaneous speaking. But you can see that carbohydrates and fats are listed right there, and that the little caricature of the lady there that's standing there looks like a healthy body. The carbohydrates require insulin. The carbohydrates and the glucose requires insulin to get in the cells. And remember, I told you there's for men, adult men, there's like 36 trillion cells in the body. For women, it's like 20 trillion cells. Every one of those cells have to have glucose and oxygen to produce energy. The energy is called ATP. That stands for adenosine triphosphate. But they all have to have oxygen and glucose in order to make energy. And so the fuel sources, when glucose requires insulin in order to get into the cell so that it can be utilized by the cell for energy. On every cell of all those trillions of cells, every one of those have what's called an insulin receptor site. And when the insulin circulating in the blood comes along and attaches to that receptor site on the cell can open up and opens up and allows glucose to get in the cell. Now, the energy is made in a little organelle or a little fixture inside the cell called the mitochondria. You need to remember that word. The mitochondria is where all the energy is produced. There's about 1,000 to 2,500 of those in every cell. Of all trillion cells, each one of them has 1,000 to 2,500 mitochondria. And so Go to the next one there, Ethan. As long as the carbohydrates are being taken in, then insulin is needed to make that carbon or the glucose in those carbohydrates. Insulin is required for the glucose to get into the cell. Remember we talked about that last week? So next slide. And as long as the body is burning carbohydrates for energy, which is depicted right here, there is no fat. Fat is not used at all. Fat cannot be burned as an energy source in the presence of insulin. Keep that in mind. Next slide. So there's a thing called balance. And like, I remember we talked about a teenager, the average 18-year-old, 19-year-old, 20-year-old. The average who is healthy is able to use carbohydrates if they're not overdoing the carbohydrates, particularly the sugars and the added sugars. If they're just doing food in the right form, the right amount, then they can eat, and it takes about 2 hours for the average carbohydrate load to be metabolized, and then that load, it'll go back down to a resting level, and there will be a beginning of utilization of fat for energy until the next time they eat, which is usually about lunchtime, and theoretically about lunchtime, and then it'll take another 2 hours and the insulin will go up because the glucose goes up, fat quits being utilized, carbohydrates are being utilized to produce glucose, the insulin goes up to drive the glucose down. And you also should think of glucose and insulin as toxic in the body. If it's floating around at high levels in the body, it may not be totally accurate to say toxic, but for the purposes of our thinking, just consider them toxic because the effects are the same thing. So, I thought you were going to have a question. Okay. As long as they're staying in balance, the body that's in balance can utilize glucose from carbohydrates and from fats as well. So next slide. Whenever carbohydrates are not consumed on a high level or not at all, then the body will go into then insulin goes down, and it allows fat to be utilized. That's what this picture right here illustrates. So next slide. Not yet. But yeah, when it's burning fat, it's ketosis. Yeah. So metabolic flexibility is when the body can use both sources. So that's what this slide is. When the insulin's up, it's going to burn. When carbs are up, insulin is going to be required, so therefore insulin goes up. Whenever the body's not taking in carbs and the carb comes down, then the insulin comes down, and then it can start using fats. That's flexibility, metabolic flexibility. So again, when the carb utilization is down, the insulin goes down, and fats are used as the fuel source. Next slide. And the byproduct of fat metabolism is ketones. Actually, fatty acids, and then the metabolic pathway makes those fatty acids, they become the glucose source. So, but ketones, interestingly enough, are one of the things besides glucose. Ketones can be utilized in the brain. It's another rabbit hole I plan to go down if I can remember where it fits in at. But ketones are really cool. The whole body can use the ketones to live on. So, and I know everybody knows about the ketogenic diet, so we're going to get back to that in a little bit. Next one. So, ketones, if you can't read that, it has a beneficial effect on the brain. It enhances cognition. It improves Alzheimer's symptoms. It has a positive effect on the muscle by improving exercise capacity. And on the body fat, it increases the metabolic rate in the fat tissue. And that makes sense because if there's no carbohydrates being utilized for glucose, then the fats have to be mobilized for glucose to meet the needs of the body. And then the heart, there's improved myocardial contractility, and ketones also inhibit inflammation. And again, from last week, there's three things that can cause insulin resistance. One of them is stress through the hormones of, help me out here a minute, John. No, the two hormones are, let me come back to it. I'll think of it in a minute. But anyway, inflammation is the second one, stress is the first one, and the third one is hyperinsulinemia, high levels of insulin. And so, cortisol, yeah, cortisol and epinephrine. Those are the two things that are stress related. They both come from the adrenal gland, but they don't have the same function. But they both drive up drive up glucose in the bloodstream. Both of, in fact, in our clinic, whenever we have a blood draw, like on a dog or a cat, particularly cats, if we draw blood on a cat, the glucose has got to be really high for us to consider that it's got diabetes, because nearly every time we draw blood on a cat, the stress that cat goes under for us that is caused by restraint and sticking a needle in his vein causes such a high level of stress that the glucose is always up. I always expect I always expect cats to have a high glucose when we draw blood on them. So, okay, next one. Increased as we progress from the 18-year-old, 20-year-old stage in our life to the 25 and the 30, we become more sedentary. We get wound up in work. We start eating junk food, and not just 3 meals a day. We'll have our big meal in the morning, or maybe we'll just have cereal. As an aside, in the school lunch program, the cereal that is provided for the kids is usually like Cheerios or Fruit Loops or something like, and a glass of orange juice. Those two items have 41 grams of sugar, and for breakfast, the recommended daily allowance for kids under 10 is 12 milligrams or 12 grams. So they're getting 3 times as much as they need just for breakfast. And sugar is addictive. Besides being toxic, it's addictive. So increased insulin is required. And if you're having breakfast and then you have a mid-morning snack, or you stop on the way to work and have a 32-ounce Dr. Pepper with a Mars bar, and then you have lunch, yeah. Brother Foreman. And then you have lunch that consists of a Mac Daddy and another soda pop, or another 32 or a 16 ounce of Coca-Cola or a Dr. Pepper, and French fries. Definitely got to have the French fries. And then to top it off, maybe a fried pie. Stop it. Stop it, right? So, and then about mid-afternoon, it's time for another, maybe a mid-afternoon ice cream, maybe a mid-afternoon another Dr. Pepper, just a little one, 12-ounce can. Maybe a Dr. Pepper, and then you go home, load up on, Mama's been cooking all day and planning a good meal for you, so you have a good heavy loaded carbohydrate bread. You got spaghetti and all the pasta. You got probably, maybe you have tea with a lot of sugar in it. Maybe you have, and then you top it off with pie or cake or something like that. And then before you go to bed, you can't go to bed without loading up on some more sweets, maybe ice cream, maybe popcorn, maybe another Sprite or something like that. But the bad thing about when you go to bed, you load up on carbs, and now you're 50 and 60 years old, instead of metabolizing those carbohydrates in 2 hours' time like you did when you were a teenager, it may take 10 to 14 hours to do that. So if you're loading up on carbs at like 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock at night, 7 o'clock, 14 hours later is going to get you through the breakfast hour, and as it's starting to come down, as that carbohydrate level is starting to come down and the insulin is coming down along with it, then you bump it up with your breakfast, which may be cereal, it may be waffles, maybe biscuits, who knows? I don't know, but it's going to bump it back up. So it never really gets to coming down. And so that constant bombardment of the cells of the body with insulin, trying to find a place to store glucose, because insulin wants to get glucose in the cells so that it can be utilized for energy. But there comes a point in time when most of the cells of the body get filled up, and there's nowhere to go for the glucose, and so the glucose stays high and the insulin stays high, and the insulin starts trying to find places to store that food or that glucose. And so rather than in the cells being utilized around the body for energy, it starts to store glucose in the fat of the body. See where we're at here. Okay, well, before we go to the next one, increased insulin leads to insulin resistance. And I was going to say, that constant bombardment of all the cells around the body, that leads to insulin resistance in the fact that those receptor sites on the cells become insensitive to the effect of the insulin. It takes more and more insulin bombarding it to finally attach so that glucose will be allowed in that cell. And that reluctance to accept insulin in the receptor site on the cell is what's called insulin resistance. Okay? And insulin resistance, go back that same cell, same one, back, yeah, causes things like diabetes. For this discussion, diabetes has been our disease that we kind of look at. But it is actually, insulin resistance is also common to all of the chronic diseases that we have. Everything from osteoarthritis to stroke and heart attack, heart disease, cancer, infertility, you name it. It's like all the chronic diseases. If you can think of a tree, and all the chronic diseases are branches of those trees, and the trunk or the main portion of the tree is insulin resistance. Insulin resistance has something in common plays a role in the manifestation of all those chronic diseases that we're faced with in our society. So insulin resistance is a big, big issue. Okay. Where was I at? And I got sidetracked there. Does anybody remember? All right. Go to the next one then. So this little slide right here starts to, as people start taking on more and more carbohydrates, especially carbohydrates that are purchased with box or barcodes on them, more and more insulin is required to open those cells up, make those cells responsive to accepting glucose, and so insulin will finally get to the point of being stuck. I know where I was going to go. We were talking about fat and fat metabolism. Try to find that slide with all the different types of things, because I want to talk to you just for a minute about one of my objectives tonight was the personal fat threshold, and this is something that you hear people, or I've heard people say they can't lose weight, and there's a reason why people say that. And find that one that's got like the depiction is in yellow with all the cells on it. That one right there, yeah. The average, okay, so like when we're born, we don't have a lot of fat on most people. The average person doesn't have a lot of fat on them. We're thin, and as you grow up, I always think about Hunter being 6'10" or 6'30", and he's just straight up and down, doesn't have a lick of fat on him, and it makes me jealous. But anyway, this first slide on the left is a picture. On the outside is the skin, and then there's a layer of fat cells underneath that, and then there's another little bit of tissue, and then there's some more cells back under there. But everybody is born with the ability to make new cells, and the ability to make new cells is called hyperplasia. That's the top one. Whenever the glucose gets filled up in the cells of the most of the cells of the body, and the glucose becomes excessive, the insulin tries to find a new place to store them and wait till the appropriate time, so that that glucose that's been stored can be utilized for energy. Again, can be mobilized out of fat, and the filling of each one of those cells is called hypertrophy. Now, there are some people that can make, seems like an unlimited number of fat cells for storage, and it doesn't affect their heart, it doesn't affect their blood pressure, they don't have a lot of the metabolic syndrome. But they can and they will reach a point in which they can't make any more cells by way of hyperplasia. And then there is a point at which they can't fill anymore. The cells get so full they can't accept any more glucose being stored in them, and so and it's in the subcutaneous fat is what I'm talking about. The subcutaneous fat there can be so many cells, and they can all get so full that the subcutaneous fat can no longer be a place of storage. So then the visceral fat starts to be, that's inside the abdomen and inside the chest, in the muscle. But really the muscle is called ectopic. When it's stored in the muscle or the liver or the pancreas, it's called ectopic fat. It's fat that's stored in places where it shouldn't be. It's bad when it's stored there. But that's called ectopic fat, and it's the spillover. So the reason that I was thinking about my own self and how I eat, and I think everybody's the same way, but they're not. And whatever your eating habits are, that's unique to you, but it's not the same for everybody. But everybody has a personal fat threshold that you cannot go past. But if that person reaches that personal fat threshold, they can't make any more fat cells, and all their fat cells are filled up, they have reached their personal fat threshold, and it begins to spill over. But the reason they can't lose weight is they don't understand that they got there by eating carbs and eating carbs and eating carbs. They never got into the point of burning fat for a fuel source. They never get there. If you don't get there, if a person doesn't get there, they can never lose weight. And so it makes some people, and I've heard people say they can't lose weight. And they're right. They cannot lose weight and continue to eat the food sources that got them there in the first place. Okay, let's go to the next one. Does everybody kind of understand that personal fat threshold thing? Okay. And so, this is just a depiction of how we eat meals 3 times a day. The carbs go up. It takes 2 or 3 hours for it to be metabolized, and the insulin is rising as well. And as the carbs subside, then we go into fat burning. That's what's shown over on the top. But as soon as you eat carbs, insulin is required, and fat cannot be utilized in the face or in the presence of insulin. So, in a metabolically balanced, flexible person, they can go through a day like this and not gain weight if their carbs are burning and their fats burning and equal. If they keep it in balance, that's called metabolic flexibility. And go to the next one, Ethan, please. But sometimes we overeat, and it takes longer than 2 hours for the insulin to burn the carbs off, and so that's what's shown right here. It goes like, instead of being 2 hours, they eat the carbohydrates for breakfast. They've woke up in fat-burning mode. But by the time breakfast is over with, they got a load of carbohydrates that have to be metabolized, and so insulin's up. They can no longer burn fat during that period of time. Go to the next slide. And if somebody decides they're going to go, they had their last meal at 6 or 7 o'clock the previous evening, and they didn't have anything more that night, sleep through the night, get up and skip breakfast in the morning, and they go to about lunchtime and have maybe a little salad, and the carb goes up, but they stay in fat burn all the way to noon, and then they'll have a little increase of carbs along about noontime for an hour or two, and then they go back into fat burn mode. Then they have supper. That's the last curve. Carb comes back up, fat burn goes down, they're burning carbs, and then as the carbs come down, they go to bed and they start back into fat burn. Go to the next slide. Okay, this is, go to the next slide. I'm going to talk about uric acid in just a few minutes. This is what uric acid, these are uric acid crystals. Go to the next slide. Okay, go back to the previous one. Go back one more. Okay, one more. All right, so that's sort of a review of where we were last week. Of you cannot burn fats if you're burning carbs, as long as the insulin is in the body or in the bloodstream, and it will be as long as the glucose is floating around freely in the blood. So if you wanted to, this insulin resistance is known as a reversible problem. I'm going to tell you an anecdotal story about a guy, a friend of mine. I've gotten acquainted with this guy in Sulphur. He started out as a client, and I've got to know him a little bit better. He weighs about probably 350, 400 pounds, 350 probably. He's an ex-Marine, ex-Special Forces guy, and he had diabetes, and his health was just awful. I don't know how, he had high blood pressure, he had heart disease, he had everything. He had things he didn't even know he had, but he knew he was diabetic. But he got cancer of his esophagus. It's been several months ago. He got cancer of his esophagus. He could no longer eat because it hurt so bad, and he went through chemo and radiation. I tried to talk to him at that time about fenbendazole, which is the active ingredient in a product that we use to deworm dogs and cats with. It's also used to deworm horses and cows, but I tried to get him to do that, and he didn't. His doctor didn't think it was helpful, that it would be helpful. But anyway, he has lost like 172 pounds. I talked to him yesterday, and he's lost 172 pounds. And his waist size, it probably was in the 50s. He's down to 32-inch waist, but he's off his insulin altogether. He no longer has diabetes, and the only thing, and probably his blood pressure is down too. So that's kind of the living proof of how insulin resistance can be reversed. It's reversible by diet, and there's a lot of research out there by different people that know about insulin resistance, but most doctors do not know about it, and they do not know the test that should be done to diagnose insulin resistance. And we talked last week, the oral glucose tolerance test is the test of choice to find out whether you're insulin resistant or not. So, yes, type 2 diabetes, yes, right. Type 1 diabetes is diabetes in which no insulin's even being made. And so it requires insulin for sure, or that person will die. And I've met somebody that had type 1 diabetes that got it when they were past 20 years of age. Most of the time, their people are born with it, but it can be acquired too. I had mentioned earlier that the sugar molecules every sugar molecule has a glucose molecule and a fructose molecule with it. And all the added sugars are primarily fructose. So what's wrong with fructose? You know where you find fructose? In nature? Yeah, but it never's by itself. It's always if it's in fruit. You know, the nice thing about fruits is there's also fiber in it, and the fiber helps ameliorate the effects of fructose when you ingest it. But it's always, if you read on a barcoded bag or a box at the grocery store, all food sources that have barcodes on them will list the ingredients. And if it says sugars or added sugars, you're getting fructose. So fructose does not occur by itself in nature. It's always with a glucose molecule. It is in berries, and they're very high in fiber, so berries are good that you eat all the berries you want to eat. Things like bananas have quite a bit less fiber in it, so bananas are not real good, but they're not as bad as alcohol. Alcohol's got fructose with no fiber. And fructose, when it enters and when it goes into the body, it goes into the stomach, and then once it gets into the small intestine, it interferes with the little mucin layer in the that it plays a protective role in the intestine, and it helps it encourages the bacteria that are in the intestine. It's called the biome. Those bad bacteria, the biome, can eat, if they don't have anything else to eat, they'll eat that lining, which exposes the cells of the intestine. And the cells of the intestine each cell is held together by a double bond of proteins. And those cells are held together very tightly. They allow for flexibility, but they're very tight. And fructose, when fructose goes down through there and is exposed to those bonds, it breaks those bonds. And that allows the contents of the intestine, not all, some of the contents of the intestine to get into the bloodstream. So you know what's in your intestines, right? Same thing that's in a sewer pipe. So, and once in the body, fructose goes by way of the portal vein to the liver. Once in the liver, fructose directly inhibits. Let's see. I'm going to look at this. Blocks the pathway that stimulates the liver to make new mitochondria, and it blocks the enzyme that removes carbons from fatty acids that could become glucose, and it blocks the production of carnitine, which carries fatty acids across the membrane wall of mitochondria and into the mitochondria so that they can be used for so that the fatty acids could even be used as a source of glucose. But it basically poisons the mitochondria of the body. So the mitochondria is where the energy sources are. It's where the power plants of all the cells of the body are. And so it actually is a poison to the body by killing the mitochondria. And then as fructose is metabolized, it becomes uric acid. And uric acid is a byproduct a lot of times of, all the time, of purines. Purines were found and have always been blamed on, the source of purines has always been blamed on red meat. But it really ends up being fructose is the source of purines that are bad. Red meat and fat are not, at least my sources say, purine or the red meats and the fats are not bad. It's the fructose that's bad. And uric acid, Ethan, put those crystals back up there, please. That is what uric acid is. And uric acid is formed in joints. It gets in particularly the toe joint and causes gout. But it also probably gets in all the joints and can cause, I really think personally, I haven't heard anybody say this, but I think personally it's one of the factors or one of the things that can cause arthritis because it does localize in joints. It also, yeah.
Because it's an acid.
Yeah.
And over time, it's eaten away that.
Cartilaginous lining? Yeah, okay. And the other thing is that it's excreted from the body by way of the kidneys. Also, it floats around in the bloodstream, and it scratches and pokes, and it causes pain in the joints, but there's no nerve receptors in the lining of the intestine, or the bloodstream. So as it's floating around in the bloodstream, you don't know it because you can't feel it, but it's poking and it's causing inflammation and damage to the arterial walls. It does that in the kidneys too. And because it's excreted out of the kidneys, but it can also conglomerate. Go back one more, Ethan. That right there. It can become what's called a uric acid stone, kidney stone. And I've not had the misfortune of having had to pass one of those things, but the people that I know had to pass. It's one of the most intense pains a person can have, and that's why trying to pass that thing through the urethra of my excretory anatomy I can't imagine that. But I see it in cats all the time. Do what? Yeah. Yep. And so, but uric acid is a byproduct of fructose metabolism too. So fructose is bad, bad, bad. And it poisons your mitochondria. It leads to the formation of uric acid. Uric acid causes all kinds of problems, but it scratches the arterial lining throughout the body, not just the kidneys, it's throughout the body. So uric acid can cause problems all over the body. Now the next thing I want to talk about is, I told you we're going to talk a little bit tonight about Alzheimer's disease and dementia and brain fog and brain issues. As you get older, one of the things that you start worrying about is whether or not you're going to end up having dementia or Alzheimer's, or those things. It's not in stone. It has not been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt. The plaque idea of the plaque buildup in the brain that has been purported to be the cause of Alzheimer's and dementia and stuff like that has not been proven. And even when medication is given to break down that plaque, the problem doesn't get any better. However, they have done, Dr. Bickman, this information has come from Ben Bickman, who's a cell biologist at Brigham Young University. But some of the people that they have had that have Alzheimer's have been given ketones, and ketones they've given ketones to people, to a person at least, that was so bad, so advanced he'd forgotten how to dress himself, and they gave ketones to this person, and he almost immediately could dress himself, and the effects were good for a day or two. So there's a pretty good, ketones are very good for the brain. But, okay, anybody want to tell me how we get ketones? You know, I mean, everybody in here knows it. You may not realize that you know it. Burning fat. When you start burning fat, a byproduct, the bottom line of burning fat is ketones. You're going to produce ketones, and ketones can be used for energy throughout the body, but particularly the brain likes ketones. And John, go ahead.
I got a question. You made me think of it since you brought it up again. I don't know the answer to. Is there a difference, or do you know, in, let's just say you ate a high-fat, you ate a steak, a ribeye, or burning the fat that you stored, and you get into that fat storage, burning that, is there a difference in the production of ketones, or is one, or do you know?
I'll tell you what I think I know. I don't think that just eating a steak, you will immediately utilize the fat from that steak for the production of ketones, because if the insulin is too high, it can't be done. It's going to be stored. But to my knowledge, as long as the insulin's low, you're in fat burning mode, and when you eat steak, that only adds to the storehouse of fat. It's not a carbohydrate. Neither raw meat or fat, protein or fat, neither one move the insulin needle at all. There's nothing happens to insulin when protein or fats are ingested. Only when carbohydrates are ingested does the insulin needle move. So, the brain can use ketones, but why doesn't it? And y'all all know the answer to this too. You just don't know. You just don't realize you know it. Nope. Exercise is good, but that's not the reason, huh? You keep on eating carbs. If you keep on eating carbs, you can't burn fat. If you can't burn fat, you can't produce ketones. You don't produce ketones, and guess what's happened in the brain, to the cells of the brain through all this? They've become insulin resistant. And there's a constant bombardment of the cells of the brain with insulin, trying to get those cells to respond to insulin's attachment so that glucose can get into the cell, but it's not happening. And so the cell, especially a part of the brain, go to the next slide where it shows the brain, Ethan, please. In the hippocampus is the part of the brain that's responsible for learning and for memory. That's where it is, that little, right there in the center of the brain. But it's responsible for memory and for learning. But it's also composed of cells. And those cells have to have glucose as a source of nutrition in order to work. But that source is more efficient for the brain if it's ketones. But as we just said, the reason that there's no ketones available is because that person keeps on eating carbohydrates and never allows the ketones, never gets into a ketotic state, making ketones, and the brain, it's there, it's ready to help him, but he can't keep eating carbohydrates for that, so that the ketones can be mobilized and utilized by the brain. And it's been shown multiple times in several different studies. It is not widely, it's not been embraced yet by the medical community. I'm convinced, because as I told you last week, I've been looking for the reason for why I had strokes and heart attacks, because I thought I was healthy. I thought I was, especially 30 years ago, I thought I was really in good shape. But I still had a stroke, and then, you know, I had that heart attack last year. But everybody, I wasn't as aware of my diet being out of whack as it was, but whenever I started my search, I got a hold of this doctor down in South Carolina, Ford Brewer. He ordered up a series of tests for me to be done at the Quest Labs over in Ardmore. And of like 10 markers for heart disease and for strokes, I had 9 of them. My uric acid was 9, and uric acid, to be safe, really, they say 5. It should at least be under 5. My triglycerides, they were the only thing that weren't real high. But everything else, all the markers, I had them. So that's when I started losing weight. And okay, so brings me to the other rabbit hole I want to go down. When you lose weight, what happens to the fat? Or what happens when you lose weight? Really, what are you saying you've done? Do what? You're getting rid of fat. You got to get rid of fat. And so what does that do to the fat pool, the subcutaneous fat? All those cells get emptied out. Do you lose those cells? No. But there's somewhere now for the extra glucose to be stored. So you've overcome insulin resistance, and you've made all those cells are now once again insulin sensitive and can receive glucose, whereas before they were maxed out and couldn't receive anymore. And it was just staying in the bloodstream with glucose and insulin floating around in there. And they're damaging the lining of the arterioles and the arteries, the small arteries. So, well, I lost my train of thought. Brain disease because I've had too many carbohydrates. Okay. So, talking about breaking down fats and losing weight, yeah. If you lose weight, if you break down your fats and mobilize the fat from the fat pool, you do lose weight. And about every 10 pounds of weight loss improves, it has a monstrous effect on improving insulin resistance. And I think John can attribute, I know I can. I can actually walk down the stairs in front of my house one at a time. I used to have to go sideways like this because my knees hurt so bad. But my arthritis is getting better. Some days my cognitive function is better. Sometimes when I get tired toward the end of the day, sometimes I don't articulate as well as I would like to be able to, maybe especially as well as I used to. But for the most part, I think I've had an improvement in that regard as well. So, all right, that's pretty much, I think, all the rabbit trails I wanted to cover tonight. But insulin resistance is a real thing, and it accounts for almost every disease. I'll also tell you about cancer. Cancer requires a lot of glucose. It requires multiple times more glucose than the average cell in the body requires. And I did listen to a video of a doctor. I can't tell you his name. I can't tell you where he's at, but he's done a lot of research on treating cancer. And he treats cancer by withholding all the carbohydrates and therefore getting rid of the glucose. In fact, he treats he's got some treatment for the glutamate that he thinks plays a role in causing cancer. And then he also, and there are, I don't know, he didn't say anything about a hyperbaric chamber being part of his therapy, but oxygen is something that cancer cells do not like. In fact, and I'll come back to it. And then, and he also uses fenbendazole, that product that is in the horse or the deworming product for animals. Otto Warburg in 1931, he was a Jew in Germany, and as the Nazi Party started to rise, rose through the ranks, came to power, they were deporting all the Jews. Everybody knows the history there. But Otto Warburg was a cell biology research guy himself. Hitler built him a laboratory in Berlin, and the charge that the man had was to find the cure for cancer. He did a lot of work. It's called the Warburg effect. And he found that sugar is what cancer cells have to thrive on. But he didn't come up with anything about fenbendazole. But the one explanation that I have read as an explanation for why fenbendazole is helpful in the process is that cancer cells have these little microtubules. When I think about microtubules, I'll think about those things right there, the organ pipes. But these microtubules are like a bunch of little organ pipes, but they're really, really small. You can't hardly see them with an electron microscope. But if you had an electron microscope, you probably could. But anyway, the thought is that those microtubules is the way that the cancer cells acquire glucose. And so they think that the fenbendazole disrupts the integrity of those tubules so that sugar can't get into the cancer cell itself. And I don't know whether that's the truth or not, but Otto Warburg did a lot of, he actually won the Nobel Prize, and he was awarded the Nobel Prize like 4 times during World War II, during that Nazi time, but he couldn't leave the country. They wouldn't let him leave the country. They didn't think he'd ever come back. Anyway, he's an interesting read himself. Otto Warburg, if you ever want to look it up. Anyway, one of the things that you might be surprised to think about is a growing baby, or from the time of conception and the formation of a zygote, a one-celled zygote. That growth, from there, the time that baby's born, no oxygen. That baby doesn't have oxygen. He's growing in an oxygen-free environment. And it was kind of interesting. The man that I was listening to when he was explaining this, his name is Lustig, and he's a medical doctor, and he's a pediatric neurologist and head of pediatrics at the University of California, San Francisco. He said that they go through like 36 doublings from the time of the zygote. It doubles and it doubles and it doubles and it doubles, and up to the time of birth, it goes through 36 doubles. And then once they get out, once they become a baby, and they breathe that first breath of air, they go through 5 more doublings. They go from 7 to 14 to 28 to 56 to 112 to 200, whatever that, 224. So you go through 5 doublings, but that's the difference between growth in an unoxygenated environment and growth in an oxygenated environment. So the cancer cell is kind of like the same thing. It grows without oxygen. And some people have gone to the trouble and the expense of buying hyperbaric chambers, and they sit in those things or lay in them, and it hyperoxygenates them, and that has a negative effect on the life of the cancer cell. Okay. There's so much information. I'm sorry that it comes out as a discombobulated mess, but I tried to arrange it, but I appreciate y'all's tolerance. Yes, Ray.
You was talking about your brain. You see on TV all the time, Prevagen. And they say that ups the brain function or makes it better. Have you heard anything about it? Or do you know anything about it?
I haven't heard anything about it. Don't know anything. Nothing equals everything that you take. I will tell you what they do say. Anything you take, like metformin for diabetes, everything's got a side effect that's almost equal to or worse than what's being utilized for treatment. And so, but nothing has the power of reversing insulin resistance, and it's strictly done through the diet. And you cannot reverse insulin resistance and continue to drink, take in sugars and added sugars in the form of soda water, juices, smoothies, bread, pasta. You gotta get rid of all of it. But if it's white, it ain't right. Even rice.
I haven't had a canned drink since he had his little talk, remember back?
I do remember that. That's what started me on this.
Haven't had a canned drink since.
Yeah, what he said, I don't know, it's been 4 or 5 months ago you said that, right first, and I've been the same way. That's what started. Actually, he said that, and then that was shortly after that's when I found out. I went by Walmart one morning and my blood pressure was 250 over 120. And then I got serious about finding out what causes all, heart attacks and strokes. And I didn't know the answer was going to be what causes all chronic disease. But all chronic disease has one thing in common, and that's insulin resistance. All chronic disease. Okay, thanks, guys. You're welcome. You're welcome.
I'm hearing that all the time, Prevagen, they say, sharpen your, everything.
I don't know anything about Prevagen. I can't speak to it.
You know, you always look, she says, there ain't no silver bullet.